Thank you for joining our presentation today. I am Ava from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My co-author is Stephanie from Hong Kong Baptist University and Sifan from University of Tennessee. Today we're going to share with you our project regarding an integrated framework of antecedents, processes, and outcomes of responsibility attribution in a pandemic. Everyone is aware of the influence of pandemic on us. So as crisis communication scholars, we're interested to understand how Americans view China and blame the Chinese government for the spread of the virus. This research question is motivated by some worrying survey results from Pew Research Center in the last year. For example, 40% of respondents believe it has been more common for Americans to express racist views about Asians after the pandemic. So it's extremely important to understand how Americans assign blame to China in a pandemic and its mechanisms. As such, we propose a framework based on the attribution theory and motivated reasoning theory. Attribution is central to individuals' perceptions of a crisis and can be affected by many factors, such as severity, involvement, or partisanship. However, these factors are examined separately in different lines of work. For example, partisanship was typically examined in political communication rather than crisis communication literature. As a result, how they intertwine to affect people's attribution of blame in crisis is still unknown. Crisis communication literature reviewed two key aspects of responsibility attribution. First one is the locality, regarding whether cause of crisis is internal or external. And the other one is called accountability, means whether the organization has resources and capacity to prevent and avoid this crisis. So in this study, we're interested to know how Americans' attribution in terms of both locality and accountability might be conditioned by motivated reasoning and defensive attribution. In order to answer this research question, we look into the literature of motivated reasoning. The theory suggests that people tend to make attribution in ways to protect their prior beliefs, such as political orientation. We expect that people of different partisanship could attribute blame of the pandemic consistent with their political views. For example, conservatives might perceive the Trump administration to have done a great job handling the pandemic, and in turn attribute higher responsibility to the Chinese government to confirm their political orientation. So that means we propose a direct effect of political orientation on the attribution of responsibility to the Chinese government. And the second factor we think about is issue involvement. Issue involvement means the pandemic is viewed to have direct consequence on people's personal lives. We know the mediated information environment was saturated with blames on China from several content analysis studies. So we hypothesize that those who are more involved should consume more information blaming China and therefore perceive the Chinese government as more responsible for the occurrence as well as the handling of the pandemic. We also think about the potential interaction between the two factors because people with different levels of involvement might process information and perceive severity in a different way, as suggested by the key arguments from elaboration likelihood model. Meanwhile, we looked into the defensive attribution literature. The theory suggests that when an observer attributes responsibility of an incident to an actor, the observer does so in a way to differentiate oneself from the actor, and the tendency to place blame increases with the severity of the incident. Past experiment studies in crisis communication show that severity plays an important role in attribution of blame, but only when locus of control is outside the organization, such as an accidental crisis. Yet, such research first manipulated clear-cut attribution of blame While in the reality, we know that the locality of control and people's attribution can be much more ambiguous and complex. In crisis with very vague attribution implications, there might be large variation of perceived severity among different publics. So severity might play an even more important role in these processes. Therefore, we hypothesize that in the pandemic, higher perception of severity leads to higher attribution, which manifests in higher locality of control and higher accountability, both of which might in turn lead to more negative outcomes. This is a summary of our hypothesis and research questions in one integrated model. As we can see, hypothesis 1 and 2 about the direct effect of political orientation and issue involvement, locality and accountability. Hypothesis 3 and 4 are related to perceived severity, both its direct effects and mediating effects. Research question 1 is about the mediating role of political orientation between the relationship and involvement and perceived severity. Last, hypothesis 5 and 6 are about the relationship between locality, accountability, and the perceptual outcomes, including negative word of mouth intentions and attitudes towards the Chinese government. So we relied on a national representative sample of a total sample size of 856. And this sample was collected from April 21st to 26th in 2020 through an online panel of subjects from Qualtrics. So all the measurements are listed here, all the key variables. They are measured on our 7-point scale. You can see the mean, standard deviation, and Cronbach's alpha of each measure here. Now let's take a look at the results. First, political orientation have direct effects on locality and accountability, even though all the indirect effects are controlled for. So those who are more conservative are more likely to perceive higher internal locality and accountability to the Chinese government. And perceived severity is positively associated with perceived locality, but not accountability of attribution. And perceived severity also mediates the effect of involvement on locality of an indirect effect of 0.05. We can also see significant moderation, which we will unpack soon in the next slide. Last, we can see the relationship between locality, accountability, and the perceptual outcomes are largely expected here. Okay, so this is the most interesting results in my view, the latent interaction between issue involvement and political orientation. We know that political orientation has a direct effect on perceived severity, right? Meaning that conservatives typically perceive low severity, but liberals typically perceive high severity. But as we can see here in the figure, among those conservatives, which is the red dotted line here, the higher level, the crisis involvement, the higher perceived severity. And the same apply to the group of liberal participants, which is the black solid line here. We can see among those who are more involved here in this crisis, they typically perceive lower severity, right? So as a whole, this interaction plot suggests that those involved partisans tend to form more realistic perception of severity that is less extreme than a typical partisan had. Okay, so now let's discuss our results together. First, political orientation served as the strongest predictor of attribution of responsibility as well as negative word of mouth intentions. So this renders strong support for motivated reasoning theory, and it shows how important it is to combine the different types of theory in explaining the influence of the pandemic. The second point we want to talk about, the effect of political orientation on perceived severity, was moderated by issue involvement. So more involved partisans, including both conservatives and liberals, tend to view the pandemic to be more serious. So it's likely that those more involved probably consume more pandemic information and systematically weigh the different factors, such as the mishandling of the Trump administration in the crisis. In other words, those more involved did not solely hold the Chinese government accountable for the pandemic. And next, issue involvement affect locality but not accountability of attribution to China, and thus mediation was through perceived severity. It is likely that severity affects attribution only in situations when this attribution is vague. Indeed, in the pandemic, locality is rather uncertain, but which agency is accountable is less ambiguous in this scenario. We also found that locality of attribution has strong effects on attitude and subsequently negative word of mouth intentions toward China, whereas accountability of attribution only affected their negative word of mouth intentions. So supplementing the intergroup communication literature, people do attribute dispositional locality of control to an outgroup actor who causes harm, but they can tell apart the different dimensions of attribution with regard to the intergroup actor in this pandemic. So here are some implications. Our findings contribute to the literature by showing how issue involvement can assist in reducing the motivated reasoning mechanism. We can see that political polarization distorts people's perceived severity, but issue involvement enables people to reduce the biased reasoning process. This contributes to the literature on both crisis communication and political communication, because they typically examine these factors separately and did not look at the interactions between these factors. And communication scholars should investigate how additional cognitive and affective factors intervene to affect people's attribution of blame in significant crisis. In addition, the study has important practical implications. It is important to deliver relevant crisis communication that enhance people's issue involvement and understanding. And communication professionals should consider all relevant aspects of attribution of responsibility, such as locality and accountability, particularly during a crisis with uncertain attribution. Okay, thank you very much for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, or if you want to get a copy of the presentation slides or the manuscript, feel free to email me through ezhao@unc.edu. Thank you.